Hello and welcome to a Canterbury Romance. Boy, these are happening later and later in the night, aren't they? I'm posting them. But my commitment to you is that I will continue doing them while I can and while I must. So let's jump right into it, shall we? We're starting a new chapter today. The Look of a Saint. Mr. John Jerd lived in a house in Street Road, a road branching westward out of Magdalene Street, which itself lies to the west of the Abbey ruins. In their old sewing room at the top of their father's ramshackle brick house, a building which seemed completely unaware of the unexpected riches of its owner, they were talking eagerly together one mid-March day, and with intense absorption in what they were saying, Mr. Gaird's two daughters, Cordelia and Crummy. These were the great sprawling girls to whom Philip Crowe had made such a contemptuous reference at the Northwold tea table. The sewing room where they were talking was also Crummy's bedroom, and Crummy, the youngest of the two, was certainly... I missed a page. Was certainly... at that moment, answering Philip's description. She was lying on her back in the bed, her fair, wavy hair disordered, her violet-colored eyes full of sleepy petulance, her skirts rumpled, her skin showing white between her drawers and her stockings, her slippered feet kicking peevishly the always crumpled coverlet of the bed. Cordelia, on the other hand, was in no sort of way fulfilling Philip's unkind picture. A very plain, very dark girl, with nothing lovable in her face except an occasional smile of melancholy, amusement, and wistful indulgence, and with a thin, awkward, bony figure. Cordelia Gaird was an unsympathetic critic of her father, a practical support to her mother, and at once the adviser and the confidant of her lively sister. And at the present moment she was sitting bolt upright in front of a little working table engaged in a piece of embroidery. "I'm not indiscriminate. How dare you call me indiscriminate, Cordy? Do you want me to count them all for you? I'm talking about now, cried Crummy. There's only Mr. Barter and Red Robinson now, and Red is afraid of me, and now we are supposed to be rich, so he doesn't count." "If by now you mean since we got rich," said Cordelia gravely, "I believe Mr. Barter would marry you tomorrow if you'd have him." Crummy toyed coquettishly with her skirt, and then began caressing with the conscious narcissism of a girlish ordinary proud of her legs, ordinately proud of her legs, the soft flesh above one of her knees. "I'd like to marry Mr. Barter, in a way," she said meditatively. Cordelia shook her head. "He would never be faithful to you. He's too indiscriminate himself." "I hate the way you say that. Every time," protested Crummy. "I could keep him faithful, you'd see. He's never lived with me, so he doesn't know." "If he's never lived with you, you've never lived with him. You'll find it horrid, Crummy, when he went off with other girls." "What about yourself?" retorted Crummy. "You know perfectly well what Mr. Evans said the other night to Mother about you being what he calls Cymric." Cordelia dug her needle into her work and sat up very straight. Her pale cheeks had flushed a little. "I told you last night, Crummy," she flung out. "I won't hear anything more about Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans is Dad's friend, and it's not right to make fun of him." Crummy removed her soft hand from her skinny flesh and pulled down her skirt with an abrupt jerk. Oh, I'm sorry, not skinny flesh. Satiny flesh. She was a good-natured girl, and next to her own rounded limbs, she loved Cordy better than anything in the world. But she adored chattering about men, and for Cordelia to rule out of court as a topic for gossip any living man was an annoyance and a vexation. "You'd never stopped me before," said Crummy. "We always discuss Dad's friends. Besides, Owen Evan isn't Dad's friend. He's a cousin of Mother's. He's our cousin, so I can say anything about him I like." Cordelia bit her lip. She felt at that moment that the one thing she could not bear was that her sister should draw her into a discussion of the only man who had ever, in all her virginal life of 30 years, taken any real notice of her. If Crummy loved Cordelia, the elder girl's devotion to Crummy knew no bounds. Megan Gerd, their mother, was a reticent woman, even with her children. She was uniformly cold to both of them. The girls had long ago decided that in her heart she was dissatisfied because neither of them was a boy. "What I think is," went on Crummy, "what I think is that Mr. Evans and you—" "Don't!" cried Cordelia. "I won't have you say it." "Well, if I mustn't say, you know what," went on Crummy obstinately. "At least I can say that I think Dad is fonder of Mr. Evans than Mummy is. I believe Mummy thinks that Mr. Evans is after you. This was too much for Cordelia. "If you dare once again," she cried, "to talk about Mr. Evans to me, I'll begin talking about you and young Mr. Decker." It was Crummy's turn to be outraged now, and she was evidently quite as much astonished as she was hurt. She rose up on her bed, propped herself up in the palms of her hands, and stared open-mouthed at the dark girl before her, whose uncomely features were at that moment rendered almost beautiful by wrath. "What?" Crummy cried. "What can you mean, Cordelia? Who told you I ever met Sam Decker, or had anything to do with him? Except at school treats, of course, and sometimes when I've taken a few cowslips in cowslip time for the church, or gone with Red to a cricket match at street, or maybe at Michaelmas Fair, where everybody meets everybody. And if you dare say I'm sweet on Sam Decker, or I've ever spoken to Sam Decker, except, of course, as a girl naturally does speak to a clergyman's son when she's helping the clergyman to distribute prizes or to carry those texts around that have those big red roses on them. I've only one thing to say to you, Cordelia Garrett, and that is, you're telling absolute lies." Note to self, let's look up what this cowslip time is. I have no idea what that is. Some quaint British custom, no doubt. At this point, Crummy pulled up her legs under her with the complete abandonment of a very little girl, bent her head till her wavy hair fell in loose wisps and loose loops upon her lap, and, covering her face with her hands, burst into passionate sobbing. If Cordelia had intended to use a formidable weapon, she had never expected that it would prove as deadly as this. Her unconscious instinct, as often happens with women who want to hurt each other, had gone to the mark quicker and surer than any reasoned attack could have done. In a flash, the elder sister recognized the truth. She saw to her confusion how possible it is to live intimately with a person all one's life, and at last be absolutely confounded by some revelation as to her secret sexual life. Isn't that true? So Crummy was in love with young Mr. Decker, really in love, just in the same sort of way as she herself was in love with. But Cordelia pulled her thoughts up with a jerk. That was daydreams and speculation too dear even to herself to dwell upon. Little Crummy. Why, this was nothing less than tragic. Gossip had already whispered to the sisters that young Mr. Decker had been keeping company with the Zoyland women out of Splot's Moor. And in any case, a marriage between the child of Johnny Jerd, even of a rich Mr. Jerd, and the son of the vicar of St. John's was a natural consummation. She laid her embroidery down and went across to her sister's side. "Forgive poor Cordy," she murmured self-reproachably. "Of course I know that young Decker is nothing to you. I was just in jest. I was just cross, Crummy, darling." And she laid her hand caressingly at her sister's head and bent down to kiss her. "Your Cordy was just cross, but I'm not cross any more, and you mustn't be cross with me." Crummy's cheeks were still wet, but her red lips parted in a faint smile. "We're a silly pair, Cordy," she murmured as they kissed each other, and she threw her arms tenderly around her sister's neck and drew her close. After a second's tight hug, the younger girl swung her legs off the bed, and they sat side by side upon the ruffled bedclothes. "Better tidy yourself up now, Crummy. Sally will be ringing the bell for tea." "And Mr. Evans is coming to tea," laughed the other roguishly. Cordelia moved now to the table and began folding up her embroidery. "I must go down and put on my coral necklace," she said to herself, "and brush my hair a bit. But what's the use? If he doesn't like me for myself, he won't care. And if he does, he won't care either." And then the queer thought came to her head. If a man wants to marry a girl, when he likes her for her mind alone, does he get any pleasure from kissing her and embracing her? So deep did this queer and troubling question sink into her consciousness that she let her embroidery lie where it fell, unwrapped to its usual piece of blue tissue paper. She herself sank down on her sewing chair and stared in front of her. She stared at the particular one of the pictures of the 4 seasons which represented autumn. Quite automatically she read, "We too have autumns, when our leaves fall loosely through the misty air, and all our good is bound in shelves, and we stand reaped and bare." She had read these words in their familiar place on the wall of the sewing room since she could read at all. Crummy was now clutching tight in her fingers the midstream of her mass of fragrant hair, pulling it around her white neck and passing the comb, with many little cries at the tangles through its own dark, down-shaken wavy curls. Oh, jeez. I'll read that sentence again. Crummy was now clutching tight in her fingers the midstream of her mass of fragrant hair, pulling it around her white neck and passing the comb, with many little cries at the tangles, through its shaken, wavy curls. I don't know how to say that one correctly. Sorry. To twist it around her head and stick the hairpins into it was a matter of a second or two. Then she slipped off her dress and, bending over the chest of drawers, sought leisurely for this and the other garment, weighing, rejecting, appraising, selecting. Hovering there, all in white, with bare arms and bare shoulders, she proceeded to smooth down, with indolent outspread fingers, in the creases of her slip, preparatory to pulling her dress over her head. Like a patient nun in a courtesan tiring room, Cordelia watched her, a little twisted smile on her lips. No. Of course Owen Evans couldn't love a person like her, but if he really thought she was Cymric in her ideas, and liked her for herself enough to marry her, why, she would marry him. Crummy was sitting on the bed now, changing her stockings, and if she was looking winsome and alluring before, she looked even more so now. As Cordelia watched the delicate softness of Crummy's limbs during this lengthy ritual, and the whiteness of her flesh thrown into tender shadows by the ruffled hem of her garment, there did come over the plain girl's mind a faint, flickering spasm of revolt. Why should her own poor knees be so bony and rough-textured? Why beneath her bony knees should her legs be like a pair of broom handles? If God had willed everything from the very beginning of the world, why had he willed that all this exquisite delight in one's own body? Crummy was at the mirror again now, turning this way and that way as she tried on her new party dress. She'd be given to one girl, while another girl felt her body to be a troublesome burden to be carried about. Oh, it didn't depend on having men to admire one, or to embrace one. It is the feeling, thought poor Cordelia, of being beautiful to one's own self that matters. It's true. The younger sister was ready now. "Cordy," she cried, reluctantly, turning her head from the mirror. "Aren't you going to change anything?" But Cordelia, rising to her feet, only gave 2 contemptuous little pats to her dark hair, only gave a contemptuous shake to her black skirt, only picked off the front of a few colored threads left by her embroidery. Instead of glancing at the mirror, she glanced over her sister's head at the colored representation of spring, the first of those 4 seasons, hanging on the wall. At the bottom of this picture, which had always been the youngster's favorite of all 4, was a little card stuck in the edge of the frame, carrying on its surface a childish sketch of a small girl, done in a crude pink and blue, the hair just an enormous smudge of chrome yellow, which bore the inscription, "Crummy by Crummy, age 6. "Come on," she said. "Let's go down and help Sally." All right. That's a good place to stop, I think. Well, we got some new characters, these sisters. They're quite delightful. I'm enjoying them a great deal. Sally and the other one, whose name I already forgot. Cordelia. Perhaps a reference to King Lear, you're thinking? I don't know where Crummy. I mean, who names their kid Crummy, right? That's a weird name. All right, I'm going to look up cowslip time now before I forget. In flowering period... okay. So cowslip is a type of flower. Well, color me embarrassed. I didn't know that. I'm not a botanist, so I'm not up on these things. All right. So until next time, cheers.